On November 29th, the first Sunday of Advent, Catholic churches in San Francisco and San Mateo counties had to be closed by noon owing to COVID restrictions. What does this mean for the future? Here to react, we're joined by Archbishop of San Francisco, Salvatore Cordileone. Your Excellency, thank you for being here. You've called your state's ban on indoor masses blatant discrimination. Why? And why are they going on?
It's blatant discrimination because the state guidelines treat secular activities with greater preference than religious worship, which is, of course, a natural right protected by the First Amendment of the Constitution. I understand the concern of health officials that when people are inside the same space for an extended period of time, it amplifies the risk of contagion because the virus is contained in that space. But there's no distinctions made among stores, whether it's a small drugstore, people go in, make a purchase and leave, that's one thing. But this equally applies to large department stores and retail outlets where people could spend an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours shopping for clothes, shopping for shoes, whatever, and stay inside that space for an extended period of time. The staff, the employees have to stay inside all day long, whereas we can keep our religious services to about an hour if we need to. And they're not making those kind of distinctions with regard to churches. So they're seeing there are some religious services that are where there have been outbreaks, but those haven't been in Catholic services. So they're not acknowledging that we have safety protocols that are very effective, and we have scientific data to show that they're effective. We're trying to be responsible, but they're sort of lumping everyone in together on this. So they're giving preference to these secular activities and even allowing these one-on-one services that involve extended time contact, like nail and hair salons and massage parlors, tattoo parlors. You can get a tattoo, but you can't go to church to worship.
Have there been any cases of COVID outbreak associated with attending indoor masses in your archdiocese?
I know of no cases of any infections even. There was the study done by the 3 infectious disease specialists over the summer who studied about 1 million masses over a 14-week period that observed the safety protocols that basically everyone is observing throughout the country. It's a model that was developed by the Thomistic Institute in Washington, D.C., and they found no outbreaks traceable to any of the masses that were following the protocols.
What is the state of affairs now? What are you allowed to do? I'm reading conflicting reports. Some say you're limited to whatever it is, 10 people at a mass. Others say indoor masses are banned altogether. What's the story?
It depends on the tier. California has a colored tier system. The darker the color, the more restrictive. Purple is the most restrictive. So this is what happened on November 29th. San Francisco and San Mateo counties removed from the red the next least restrictive into the purple. The purple tier allows no indoor worship services. It does allow indoor retail at 25% capacity. So it depends on the tier that the county is in. Marin County is also in our archdiocese. That's on the north side of the Golden Gate Bridge. Marin is still one of the few counties left in the red. Red allows 25% capacity for church services, or a numerical cap of 100, whichever is lower. But that also is discriminatory because there's no numerical cap on indoor retail. It's an absolute 25%. So I think for them to treat us fairly equally, really, religious service worship should have a preferential treatment because the state has no right to say we're not essential. That is truly an offense to say that we're not essential. Of course, we're essential. But at least for equality, if they were to allow us 25% capacity without a numerical limit in purple as well as red tier, we would be happy with that because we'd be on a par with indoor retail. And for me, it's a reasonable restriction to ensure that people are safe during indoor worship.
Yeah. This past September, the U.S. Department of Justice warned San Francisco officials that the city's restrictions on public worship may be unconstitutional. And they pointed out that tattoo parlors, hair salons, massage parlors, other businesses were being allowed to operate between 10 and 50% capacity, while houses of worship were not. Now, you started a campaign, Free the Mass, and held a demonstration that got a lot of attention. Eventually, you were permitted to have 25% capacity or up to 100 worshipers inside. Now those restrictions are back and churches are closed, but salons can remain open and massage parlors. I mean, there doesn't seem to be any sense of what's at stake here or the disproportionate application of these regulations.
Yes, well, we still have the Free the Mass campaign, and I would ask people to go online and sign the petition if they haven't yet at freethemass.com. It's also in Spanish, queremoslamisa.com. But San Francisco at that time was being even more restrictive than California. So after this letter from the Department of Justice, they adjusted their local county guidelines. Counties are allowed to be more restrictive than the state. So the local county guidelines are now in conformity with the state guideline. But so now it's an issue of what's going on at the state level.
Pope Francis wrote an op-ed in the New York Times last week, and in it he takes a swipe at people who oppose lockdowns and measures the government have taken so far. He writes, some groups protested refusing to keep their distance, marching against travel restrictions, as if measures that governments must impose for the good of their people constitute some kind of political assault on autonomy or personal freedom. Looking to the common good is much more than the sum of what is good for individuals. It means having a regard for all citizens and seeking to respond effectively to the needs of the least fortunate. He did not address restrictions on worship and access to the sacraments directly. But do you feel you're putting personal rights above the common good by wanting your people to celebrate in person indoors?
I have said repeatedly from the beginning, when the shelter-in-place orders were first issued, I've said repeatedly that the state has a right and responsibility to tell faith communities what they have to do to protect public health when they worship. But the state has no authority to tell faith communities that they cannot worship or to issue restrictions so severe as to effectively ban public worship. So I agree that the state has the responsibility to protect public health, and we're observing these safety guidelines the state is issuing about with our safety protocols like everyone else about face coverings are required. Social distancing is required. The churches rope off the pews. They mark spots in the pews. They mark spots in the aisle for when people are coming up for communion. They sanitize the surfaces, pews, and other high-touch surfaces between services. The face coverings during communion for the communion minister. So we're doing all of this. That's not the problem. We accept that we have to abide by certain restrictions. As I said a moment ago, that 25% capacity in our churches for me is reasonable as long as there's no numerical limit. So I certainly have said all along consistently, I accept that principle, but I do not accept that the state can tell the church not to worship. Now,
what's the spiritual impact?
Outdoors. In some parts of the state right now, we're blessed with some good weather here locally. The weather is amenable to outdoor worship, but it's not going to be long before the weather changes. It's going to get windy, the rains will come, and so forth. So this cannot go on indefinitely.
Archbishop, before I let you go, what's the spiritual impact of this? The deprivation of the sacraments and people not being able to worship, particularly as we enter the Advent season?
Our people are suffering and they're struggling. I'm hearing more and more from our people. They want the bishops to be bolder. They want me to be bolder. The people are suffering very much from deprivation of the sacraments. You cannot live stream Holy Communion. And that plus the isolation, as I've said before, the church means assembly. The church is an assembly of people. That's our very identity, is coming together to worship God with and under Christ, or rather to worship with and under Christ in the body of Christ. So it really, in a way, goes against our nature, and our people are suffering from being cut off from their faith community, cut off from the practice of the faith, and especially the most essential part of the practice of our faith, which is Holy Communion and the whole sacramental life of the church.
Well, we will keep in touch with you about this, and thank you for the update. Archbishop Salvatore Cordileone, I thank you for your time.
Thank you.